There are cases, I confess, that I have kept close to my heart, rather than offering to the public's curiosity. Not from any lack of interest in their particulars, but from a deeper instinct, the one that tells a doctor when to speak, and when to simply sit in quiet, witness beside grief. The affair of the weeping portrait troubled me for years after its resolution, not because justice failed to arrive, but because it arrived so quietly, in a house already thick with sorrow. Holmes solved it with his customary brilliance, yet what stayed with me was not the chemistry or the deduction, but the way a family's trust had been twisted into something venomous beneath a coat of golden varnish. I kept my notes private, honoring a promise made beside a dying fire. Now, enough years have passed, and the man at the center of it all has given his blessing. So I open that chapter of my casebook again, carefully, as one might open a long sealed room to let in light and air at last. It was late November, 1880-something. The exact year matters less than the season itself, which had settled over London with the particular melancholy of autumn turning its face toward winter. The fog that night was the thick, yellowish sort that crept along Baker Street, like something alive and patient, muffling the clatter of hansom cabs and wrapping every gas lamp in a halo of amber gloom. Inside our sitting room at 221B, the fire had burned down to embers, glowing soft and red, painting the walls in gentle, shifting shades of warmth. The scent of coal smoke mingled with the faint leather and tobacco smell that had become as familiar to me as my own pulse. The scent of home, really, though I might not have named it so at the time. I sat in my usual chair, a medical journal open across my knee, though I had not turned a page in some minutes. My attention had drifted, as it often did on such evenings, to the comfortable rhythm of the room itself, the distant tick of the clock on the mantelpiece, the occasional pop and sigh of settling coals, the scratch of Holmes's pen as he inscribed notes in that crabbed, impatient hand of his. He was at the table near the window, bent over a sheaf of papers, his long fingers stained faintly with ink. He had been restless all week. No cases of interest, he claimed, only tedious inquiries about missing dogs and disputed wills. The energy that usually drove him toward revelation had turned inward, or coiling like a spring wound, too tight. Outside, the fog pressed close against the glass, as though it wished to enter and share our warmth. The street below was nearly silent, save for the shuffle of a late pedestrian, the muffled thud of boots on damp pavement. London, in such moments, felt like a city folded in on itself, each household a small island of light and breath suspended in the greater dark. It was a night for staying indoors, for tea and stillness, for the small pleasures of safety and shelter. Or so I thought, until the knock came at our door. It was not the polite tap of Mrs. Hudson delivering supper, nor the familiar rhythm of Lestrade or Gregson arriving with some official puzzle. This knock was urgent, uneven, the sound of knuckles striking wood with barely restrained panic. Holmes's pen paused mid-stroke. He glanced toward the door, his sharp grey eyes narrowing slightly, already calculating. Then came the sound of voices below. Mrs. Hudson's gentle murmur of surprise, a man's voice, breathless and strained, asking, no, pleading, for Mr. Sherlock Holmes. Holmes set his pen down with the deliberate care of a man suddenly, intensely interested. "Well, Watson," he said quietly, a faint smile playing at the corner of his mouth, It seems the evening has other plans for us." A moment later, the door to our sitting room swung open and Mrs. Hudson appeared, her kind face creased with concern. Behind her stood a man I did not recognize, though his appearance spoke volumes, even before he uttered a word. He was perhaps 40 years of age, well dressed in a dark overcoat and silk scarf, though both were damp with fog and clung to him awkwardly. His face was pale, his eyes red-rimmed, whether from weeping or sleeplessness. I could not immediately say. His hands trembled as he removed his hat, clutching it before him like a shield. The scent of rain and cold air entered with him, dispelling some of the room's settled warmth. "Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice cracking slightly, "forgive the intrusion at such an hour. My name is Edmund Ashford. I was told, that is, I have heard, you are a man who deals in the impossible." Holmes rose smoothly, gesturing towards the chair nearest the fire. "The impossible is often merely the improbable, dressed in poor lighting, Mr. Ashford. Please sit. Warm yourself. Mrs. Hudson, tea, if you would be so kind." Our landlady nodded and withdrew, closing the door softly behind her. I set aside my journal and rose as well, assuming my familiar role, half observer, half physician, ready to assess whether our visitor's distress was solely emotional or had some physical component. Holmes watched him with that peculiar intensity of his, the kind that made me think of a hawk sighting movement in tall grass. Ashford sank into the chair as though his legs could no longer support him. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring into the fire. The light played across his features, revealing the deep lines around his mouth, the shadow of stubble on his jaw. A man who had not slept properly in days, perhaps. "My wife is dead," he said at last, the words emerging flat and hollow, as though he had repeated them so many times they had lost all meaning. 4 days ago, the doctor said her heart simply stopped. But that is not the whole of it, Mr. Holmes. That is not why I am here." Holmes lowered himself into his own chair, steepling his fingers beneath his chin. "I am listening, Mr. Ashford." The man took a shuddering breath. "My wife, Constance, was a beauty. Everyone said so. When we married, I commissioned a portrait of her, a fine thing, oil on canvas, by a reputable artist. It hung in our drawing-room for 3 years, without incident. Then, a month ago, I had it restored. The colours had dulled somewhat, and I wished to see her as she'd been on our wedding day. I hired a man, a restorer, named Cornelius Vale, who came recommended. He worked on it for 2 weeks, in our home, and when he finished, it was magnificent, more vivid than memory itself." He paused, his hands tightening around the brim of his hat. Outside, the fog shifted, thickening, and a distant church bell tolled the hour, 10 o'clock, each note muffled and slow. Holmes did not move, did not interrupt, simply waited with that infinite patience he could summon when a story required its own time to unfold. 3 nights ago, Ashford continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, we had guests for dinner. Afterward, we retired to the drawing-room. The fire was lit, as it always is on cold evenings. Constance sat in her usual place near the hearth. And then one of our guests, a lady, cried out. She was staring at the portrait. We all turned to look. He lifted his gaze to meet Holmes's, and I saw something in his eyes then. Not merely grief, but a kind of primal unease, the shadow of something that had shaken his understanding of the world. The portrait was weeping, Mr. Holmes. Dark tears, like varnish, running from her painted eyes, slowly, as though she truly wept. My wife saw it. She went pale, clutched at her chest, said she could not breathe. We carried her upstairs. By morning, she was gone. The room fell silent. Even the fire seemed to hush, as though listening. Holmes's expression remained neutral, but I knew him well enough to see the flicker of interest behind his eyes, not in the supernatural claim, but in the precision of the phenomenon, the timing, the theatre of it. And since her death? Holmes asked quietly. The servants refused to enter the drawing-room. My cousin, Leonard, who lives with us, insists the portrait is cursed, that it should be burned. But he faltered, I cannot bear to destroy her image, and yet I cannot bear to look at it. The house feels wrong, Mr. Holmes, cold, as though something terrible lingers there. Mrs. Hudson returned then with the tea-tray, moving quietly, setting it on the table between us. The familiar ritual, the clink of porcelain, the steam rising fragrant and herbal, seemed almost absurdly normal against the strangeness of Ashford's tale. Holmes poured, handed the man a cup, waited until he had taken a sip before speaking again. You mentioned a cousin, Leonard Ashford, I presume. He resides with you? Yes, my father's nephew. He has limited means. I offered him a place in our home some years ago. And his relationship with your wife? A flicker of something, discomfort perhaps, crossed Ashford's face. Cordial? Polite? Leonard keeps mostly to himself. I see. Holmes set down his own cup, untouched. Tell me, Mr. Ashford, do you believe in curses? The man hesitated, then shook his head slowly. I did not. I do not. But what I saw, what we all saw, I cannot explain it by any rational means. Holmes smiled then, a thin, almost wolfish expression. The rational, Mr. Ashford, is often hiding in plain sight, disguised as the impossible. I will visit your home tomorrow morning with your permission. I should like to see this weeping portrait for myself. Relief washed over Ashford's features. Visible as a physical thing, the loosening of his shoulders, the first deep breath he seemed to have taken since entering. Thank you, Mr. Holmes, thank you. I will send my carriage for you at 9 o'clock, if that is acceptable. Perfectly acceptable. And Mr. Ashford, until we arrive, I must ask that no one touch the portrait or disturb the drawing-room in any way. Can you ensure that? I can. Good. Holmes rose, and Ashford followed suit, shaking Holmes's hand with a grip that seemed steadier now, as though hope itself were a kind of medicine. He bid us both good night and left, Mrs. Hudson seeing him down the stairs. The sound of the front door closing echoed up to us, followed by the receding clip of boots on the pavement outside, swallowed quickly by the fog. I turned to Holmes, who had returned to the window, gazing out into the murky yellow night. What do you make of it? I asked. He did not answer immediately, his profile sharp against the dim glow of the street lamp below. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful, almost absent, as though he were speaking more to himself than to me. A portrait that weeps varnish, Watson. Not blood, not water, but varnish. And only in the presence of heat, I suspect. The drawing-room fire. Not supernatural, then, but chemical. The question is not how it was achieved, but why. You think it was deliberate? I think, my dear Watson, that coincidences are rarely so theatrical. He turned to face me, and in the firelight his eyes gleamed with that peculiar hunger he always wore when a puzzle truly intrigued him. A portrait weeps, a woman dies. the household believes in a curse. But who benefits from that belief? Who wishes the family frightened? And who, I wonder, knew precisely where Mrs. Ashford would be sitting when the weeping began? He moved back to the table, shuffling through his papers until he found a blank sheet. Taking up his pen, he began to sketch, quick, sure lines forming the rough outline of a room, a fireplace, a canvas on the wall. We will see it for ourselves tomorrow. But I suspect, Watson, that we are not dealing with the supernatural at all. We are dealing with something far more dangerous, a human mind that understands both chemistry and cruelty, and wields them like twin blades. I sat down again, suddenly weary, feeling the weight of the fog pressing against the windows, the lateness of the hour settling into my bones. You think she was murdered? I think, Holmes said softly, still sketching, that we are looking at a locked room of a very particular kind, not locked by doors, but by expectation. Everyone saw the weeping portrait, everyone assumed the supernatural, and in the chaos of that assumption, Watson, the real cause of her death, went entirely unnoticed. Set down his pen and looked at me, his expression grave. Tomorrow we will unlock that room, and when we do, I suspect we will find that the true horror was never the portrait at all. The fire crackled, sending up a small shower of sparks. Outside, the fog thickened, and London settled deeper into its November night, full of secrets and sorrow, waiting for the light of morning to reveal what darkness had concealed. I picked up my journal once more, but found I could not return to my reading. Instead, I sat in silence, watching Holmes work, and wondered what daylight would bring to the house where a portrait had wept, and a woman had died, and the truth lay hidden beneath layers of varnish and grief. Morning arrived slowly, as though reluctant to dispel the previous night's fog. I woke to find the November sun pale and watery behind the clouds, casting a diffuse, silvery light across Baker Street. The air held that particular chill of late autumn, not bitter, but persistent, the kind that seeped through wool and stone alike, reminding Londoners that winter was merely waiting its turn. I dressed warmly, choosing a heavy tweed suit and my thickest scarf, and descended to find Holmes already at breakfast, though breakfast was perhaps too generous a term for the single piece of toast and black coffee that constituted his morning meal when a case consumed him. He looked up as I entered, his eyes bright with that restless energy I had come to recognize. "Ah, Watson. Good. I've been consulting Bradshaw's. The Ashford residence is in Belgravia, Eaton Square, to be precise. Old money, or what passes for it, in a city constantly remaking itself. The house will tell us much before we even cross the threshold." I poured myself tea, added a generous helping of Mrs. Hudson's excellent eggs and bacon to my plate, and settled across from him. Through the window, I could see the street coming to life. A milk cart rattling past, a crossing sweeper at his patient work, Nanny shepherding two small children bundled against the cold. London's great machine, turning as it always did, indifferent to individual tragedy. You think the house itself is significant? Everything is significant until proven otherwise, Holmes replied, setting down his cup with a decisive clink. A home is not merely brick and mortar, Watson. It is a stage upon which people perform their daily dramas, often unconsciously. The arrangement of furniture, the placement of portraits, the flow of servants through hallways, all of it speaks, if one knows how to listen. And in this case, we are looking for very specific things, sightlines, heat sources, and who had access to what and when. At precisely 9 o'clock, a handsome black carriage drew up before our door, the horse's breath steaming in the cold air. The driver, a weathered man in dark livery, touched his hat as we emerged and handed us up into the cushioned interior. The journey through London's morning streets was a study in contrasts. The narrow, crowded lanes near Baker Street, giving way gradually to wider thoroughfares lined with plane trees, their bare branches reaching like skeletal fingers toward the pale sky. Chimney smoke rose from 1,000 hearths, mingling with the remnants of last night's fog to create a gauzy veil that softened the city's harder edges. Holmes sat in silence, his gaze fixed on the passing scene, though I suspected he saw very little of it. His mind, I knew, was already in the Ashford drawing-room, reconstructing the scene, testing hypotheses, discarding impossibilities. I had learned over our years together that these periods of intense internal focus were best left undisturbed, so I turned my own attention outward, watching as the city transformed around us. We passed Hyde Park, its iron railings black against the winter grass, then entered Belgravia proper, that district of cream-coloured stucco and columned porticos, where wealth displayed itself with a kind of architectural confidence that bordered on arrogance. The houses here stood tall and close together, their facades pristine, their windows gleaming even in the weak morning light. Gas lamps, not yet extinguished, still burned at intervals, though their glow was ghostly now, diminished by daylight. A street vendor sold hot chestnuts on one corner, the sweet, charred scent drifting into the carriage as we passed. A uniformed constable walked his beat, hands clasped behind his back, nodding to a well-dressed gentleman ascending the steps of a gentleman's club. The carriage turned into Eaton Square and slowed before a particularly imposing townhouse, 4 stories of pale stone with a black painted door flanked by Ionic columns and a small iron-railed courtyard before it. The windows were tall and evenly spaced, their curtains drawn in most rooms, giving the facade a shuttered, withdrawn appearance. Even from the street, there was something about the house that felt diminished, not neglected precisely, but subdued, as though grief had settled over it like a pall, and had not yet lifted. Holmes descended first, and I followed, my boots striking the pavement with a hollow sound that seemed too loud in the quiet square. The driver remained with the horses, and we approached the door. Before Holmes could raise his hand to knock, it swung open, revealing a butler, elderly, thin as a whip, with silver hair and the kind of posture that spoke of decades in service. His face was professionally neutral, but I caught the flicker of something in his eyes. Exhaustion, perhaps, or wariness. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he said, his voice quiet and precise. "Mr. Ashwood is expecting you. Please come in." We stepped into the entrance hall, and I was immediately struck by the quality of the light, or rather, the lack of it. Despite the tall windows visible from outside, the interior felt shadowed, close. Heavy curtains, dark wood panelling, and a floor of black and white. Marble tiles created an atmosphere of sombre elegance. A wide staircase curved upward to the left, its balustrade carved with acanthus leaves. To the right, a corridor stretched toward the back of the house, and directly ahead, through an open doorway, I glimpsed what must be the drawing-room. The scent of the house was distinct. Beeswax polish and old fabric, coal smoke and something else, a faint acrid note I could not immediately place. Chemical, perhaps, or medicinal. Holmes's nostrils flared slightly, and I knew he had noted it as well. The butler took our coats and hats with practised efficiency. "Mr. Ashford will join you shortly," he said, gesturing towards the drawing-room. "He asks that you make yourselves comfortable, though I fear comfort is in short supply at present." There was a wealth of meaning in those last words, delivered without inflection, yet weighted none the less. Holmes inclined his head in acknowledgment, and we crossed the threshold into the drawing-room. It was a spacious chamber, elegantly appointed in the manner of the wealthy middle class, aspiring to aristocratic taste. The walls were papered in a deep green damask, and the furniture, sofas, chairs, side tables, was of dark mahogany, upholstered in burgundy velvet. A piano stood in one corner, its lid closed, a stack of sheet music gathering dust atop it. Bookcases lined one wall, filled with leather-bound volumes that looked more decorative than read. The floor was covered with a Persian carpet in muted reds and golds, and at the far end of the room a fireplace of white marble dominated the space, its mantelpiece crowded with porcelain figurines and a French clock that ticked steadily, the only sound in the oppressive quiet. And above the fireplace, commanding the room with an almost physical presence, hung the portrait. Even knowing what we had come to see, I felt an involuntary catch in my breath. It was a remarkable piece of work. Life-sized, or nearly so, depicting a woman in her late 20s. She sat in a garden setting, dappled sunlight filtering through painted leaves, her hands folded gracefully in her lap. Her dress was pale blue silk, rendered with extraordinary skill, each fold and shadow precise. But it was her face that drew the eye and held it. She was beautiful, yes, but there was more than beauty there, a quality of serenity, of gentle intelligence, captured in the artist's brushwork. Her eyes, dark and luminous, seemed to gaze directly at the viewer, not challenging, but questioning, as though inviting conversation. And from those eyes, even now in the cold morning light, with no fire burning in the grate, faint, dark trails ran down the painted cheeks, like the ghost of tears. Holmes approached slowly, his hands clasped behind his back, his head tilted slightly as he studied the canvas. I followed, and as we drew closer, the trails became more distinct. They were not paint, that much was clear. The surface beneath was undisturbed. The dark substance sat atop the varnish layer, viscous and uneven, as though it had indeed dripped and dried in place. I reached out, almost unconsciously, intending to touch it. But Holmes's hand shot out and caught my wrist. "Not yet, Watson," he said softly. "Observe first. Interfere later." He released me and began to circle the portrait, moving with slow deliberation, examining it from every angle. I watched him work, noting how his gaze tracked not just the canvas itself, but its relationship to the room. The distance from the fireplace, the angle of light from the windows, the height at which it hung. He crouched, peering up at the frame's underside. He stood on a chair, producing his magnifying glass from an inner pocket to scrutinize the top edge of the canvas and the ornate gilded frame that enclosed it. "The frame is deep," he murmured, more to himself than to me. "More depth than necessary for a canvas of this size, and the ornamentation along the inner edge. See here, Watson, how elaborate it is. Scrollwork, acanthus leaves, tiny grooves carved into the plaster gilt. One might almost hide something small within such complexity. A channel, perhaps, or a reservoir." I moved closer, following his gaze. The frame was indeed unusually ornate, almost baroque in its detail. and now that he mentioned it, the inner edge, where frame met canvas, did seem to have a peculiar depth to it. A narrow groove running the perimeter, barely visible unless one looked directly at it. Behind us, a throat cleared discreetly. We turned to find Edmund Ashford standing in the doorway, and in the full light of his own drawing-room, I could better assess the toll the past days had taken on him. He was older than I had initially estimated, perhaps mid-40s rather than 40, and his face bore the marks of sleeplessness and strain. His clothes, though well-tailored, hung slightly loose on his frame, as though he had lost weight recently. But his eyes, when they met Holmes's, held a desperate hope. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he said, his voice hoarse. "Thank you for coming. I apologize for not greeting you at the door. I find it difficult to enter this room." "Perfectly understandable," I said, moving toward him. "Please sit. You need not stay if it distresses you, but Mr. Holmes may have questions." Ashford nodded and sank into one of the chairs near the door, as far from the portrait as the room allowed. "Ask whatever you need." Holmes descended from his chair, pocketing his glass. "The restorer, Cornelius Vale. How long was he in your home?" 2 weeks. He worked here in the mornings, mostly, while the light was good. He used the room you see before you, as the painting could not be moved without risk." "And during those 2 weeks, was he ever alone?" Ashford frowned, thinking. Yes, often. I was at my office during the days. My wife sometimes kept him company. But not always. The servants, of course, came and went." "Your cousin, Leonard, was he present?" A flicker of something, discomfort again, crossed Ashford's features. "Leonard was here, yes. He takes an interest in art. He and Vale spoke several times about techniques, materials. Leonard was quite enthusiastic about the restoration. In fact, he was the one who suggested it, now that I recall. He mentioned that the portrait had lost its luster and said he knew of an excellent restorer." Holmes's expression did not change, but I saw the minute tightening around his eyes that indicated intense interest. "I see. And this restorer, Vale, did he bring his own materials, or did he request anything specific from your household?" "He brought most things himself. Brushes, varnishes, small bottles of various substances. Though I do recall him asking for access to the fireplace for heating certain resins. He said it was part of the process, warming materials to make them more workable." "The fireplace in this room?" "Yes." Holmes nodded slowly, his gaze returning to the portrait. "And on the evening of the incident, the night your wife died, there were guests present, you said?" "Yes, my solicitor and his wife. They dined with us. Afterward, we came here for port and conversation. Constance sat there." He gestured toward a chair positioned near the hearth, upholstered in the same burgundy velvet as the other furniture. Her usual place. She liked the warmth of the fire. "Always the same chair?" "Always." Holmes moved to the chair in question, running his hand along its back, then turned his attention to the fireplace itself. It was a fine example of Victorian craftsmanship, the marble carved with classical motifs. The grate was clean, recently cleared, though a few lumps of coal remained unburned in the scuttle beside it. Holmes knelt, peering into the firebox, then at the mantelpiece, then up at the portrait again, measuring distances with his eyes. "Who lit the fire that evening?" "One of the servants, Perkins, I believe, our footman. He always tends to the fires in the public rooms." And afterward? Who has been in this room since your wife's death? Only myself, briefly, and the servants, to draw the curtains and clear away the tea things, but no one has touched the portrait. Good. Holmes stood, brushing his hands together. Mr. Ashford, I should like to speak with your household staff, if I may. The footman who lit the fire, certainly, but also anyone else who might have observed Mr. Vale at work during those 2 weeks, and I should very much like to meet your cousin, Leonard. Ashford paled slightly at that, but nodded. Of course. Leonard is here. He has been helpful in his way, managing affairs while I have been unable to think clearly. I'll send for him, and for Perkins. He rose and crossed to the bell-pull near the door, giving it a sharp tug. Within moments, the elderly butler appeared. Wilkins, please ask Mr. Leonard to join us, and send Perkins up as well. The butler bowed and withdrew. Ashford remained standing, his hands gripping the back of a chair as though to steady himself. Mr. Holmes, do you believe? That is, have you formed any conclusion? Holmes turned to him, and his expression was surprisingly gentle. I believe, Mr. Ashford, that your wife's death was not the work of any curse, nor of supernatural forces. I believe it was very carefully planned and executed by someone who understood chemistry, who had access to this house and intimate knowledge of your household's routines. As to who and how and why, those answers will reveal themselves shortly. But I give you my word, by the end of this day you will know the truth. Ashford's shoulders sagged, whether in relief or dread, I could not say. But before he could respond, footsteps sounded in the corridor, and a new figure appeared in the doorway. He was younger than Ashford by perhaps a decade, lean and dark-haired, dressed in a morning coat of good quality, but slightly worn at the cuffs. His face was angular, almost handsome, with sharp cheekbones and a narrow mouth. But it was his eyes that caught my attention, pale blue and restless, darting from Holmes to me to the portrait, with an expression I could not quite read. Curiosity, apprehension, something else entirely. Edmund, he said, his voice smooth and cultured, you sent for me? You must be Mr. Sherlock Holmes. And Dr. Watson, I presume. I am Leonard Ashford, Edmund's cousin, and, I suppose, the keeper of this melancholy house in his time of grief. He extended his hand, and Holmes shook it briefly. I did the same, noting that his palm was damp, his grip just slightly too firm. Mr. Ashford, Holmes said pleasantly, I understand you were instrumental in arranging the portrait's restoration. Leonard's eyes flickered toward the painting, then away. I merely suggested it. Edmund wished to see his wife's beauty preserved, and the portrait had grown dull. I happened to know of Mr. Vale's reputation. I thought I was doing them both a kindness. His voice held a faint note of defensiveness, as though he anticipated accusation. And Vale's work? Were you satisfied with it? It was magnificent. Too magnificent, perhaps, given what followed. He moved further into the room, closer to the portrait, and stared up at it with an expression I could only describe as bitter. Some things are better left untouched, Mr. Holmes. Some memories should be allowed to fade. The words hung in the air, strange and heavy. I glanced at Edmund Ashford, whose face had gone very still, and at Holmes, who watched Leonard with the focused intensity of a cat observing a bird, just out of reach. Before anyone could speak, another figure appeared, a young man in footman's livery, his face anxious. "You sent for me, sir?" Holmes turned to him with a slight smile. "Ah, Perkins. Yes. I have just a few questions for you about the evening 4 nights ago. You lit the fire in this room, I understand?" "Yes, sir. Same as every evening when the family takes coffee here after dinner." "And did you notice anything unusual that night? Anything different about the portrait, perhaps, or the room itself?" Perkins swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. His gaze slid toward the painting, then quickly away, as though he feared it might weep again if he looked too long. "No, sir. That is, everything was as it always was, until the lady screamed. I was in the hall, heard the commotion, came running, and I saw—" He trailed off, his voice faltering. "You saw the portrait weeping," Holmes supplied gently. "Yes, sir. Dark tears running down. It was unnatural, sir. Wrong. The missus, she saw it too, and she clutched her chest and said she couldn't breathe right. We carried her upstairs, and by morning—" He stopped, his eyes bright with unshed tears. Holmes nodded, his expression kind. "Thank you, Perkins. That will be all for now." The young man fled with obvious relief, and silence reclaimed the room. Outside, I heard the distant rumble of a cart, the cry of a street vendor, the ordinary sounds of London carrying on with its daily business. Inside, the drawing-room felt like a sealed chamber, airless and waiting, the portrait presiding over us all like a silent judge. Holmes moved back to the fireplace, back to the chair where Constance Ashford had sat in her final moments, and stood there, perfectly still, his eyes half closed in concentration. And watching him, I felt the first stirring of understanding, not the full picture, not yet, but the shape of it forming in the shadows. Something terrible had happened in this room, something deliberate and cruel, and the portrait, for all its beauty, had been not a victim, but a weapon. The morning had deepened by the time Holmes and I departed the Ashford residence, though deepened was perhaps too generous a word, for the pale, watery progression of November daylight. The sun remained hidden behind layers of cloud, and the air had grown colder, carrying with it the threat of rain, or perhaps sleet. We walked rather than taking the carriage, Holmes insisting that he needed to think, and thinking for him had always been best accomplished in motion. We moved through Belgravia's orderly streets in silence at first, our breath misting before us, the sound of our footfalls sharp against the pavement. I watched Holmes from the corner of my eye, noting the familiar signs, the slight forward lean of his posture, the way his hands clasped behind his back, fingers occasionally twitching as though conducting some invisible orchestra of thought. His lips moved soundlessly, forming words or perhaps chemical formulae, testing hypotheses in the private laboratory of his mind. At last, as we turned onto Sloane Street, leaving the pristine facades of Belgravia behind, he spoke. "Did you observe Leonard Ashford's hands, Watson?" I considered. I shook his hand. It was damp, slightly cold. Nervousness, I assumed. "Yes, nervousness. But more than that, look at your own hand now." I raised my right hand, puzzled. "I see nothing unusual." "Precisely. Your hand is that of a medical man, clean, nails trimmed, perhaps a faint stain from ink, or the occasional trace of carbolic. Now recall Leonard's hand. The nails were clean, yes, but examine your memory more closely. The cuticles, the fingertips." I closed my eyes, summoning the image. There was a faint discoloration, dark, almost like soot, beneath the nails. "Excellent, Watson. Not soot, however. Something more specific. Charcoal, perhaps, or lamp black. Substances used in art, in sketching and mixing pigments. Our Mr. Leonard Ashford has been handling artists' materials recently, though he made no mention of artistic pursuits himself. You think he was involved in the restoration? That he worked with Vale? Holmes's expression was thoughtful, distant. I think there are layers to this matter that have not yet been peeled back. Leonard suggested the restoration. Leonard introduced Vale to the household. Leonard has been handling art materials, and Leonard stands to inherit, does he not, should his cousin die without issue. Edmund and Constance Ashford had no children, I noticed. No nursery, no toys, no evidence of young life in that sombre house. Good God, Holmes, you're suggesting— I'm suggesting nothing yet, merely assembling data points. But yes, Watson, I'm very much interested in Mr. Leonard Ashford's financial situation, his relationship with the deceased, and his knowledge of chemistry and art, which is why we are going to visit Mr. Cornelius Vale and see what manner of man would undertake such a restoration. We hailed a hansom on King's Road, and Holmes gave the driver an address in Chelsea, a less fashionable quarter than Belgravia, though not without its own character. As we clattered through the streets, I found my thoughts returning to the portrait itself, to those dark trails running from painted eyes, and to Constance Ashford's final moments in her usual chair by the fire. There was something in the configuration of that room, in the precise placement of furniture and flame and canvas, that suggested terrible calculation. Chelsea in late autumn possessed a bohemian melancholy that suited our errand. Here the houses were narrower, packed more tightly together, their facades less pristine than Belgravia's cream-coloured elegance. Artists' studios occupied upper floors, their large windows facing north to catch the steady light. Small galleries and print shops clustered on street corners. The scent of turpentine and linseed oil mingled with coal smoke and the ever-present Thames dampness that permeated this part of London. We disembarked before a narrow building of red brick, 4 stories tall, with a bow window on the ground floor displaying several paintings, landscapes mostly, competent, but unremarkable. A painted sign above the door read, Vale and Associates, Fine, Art Restoration. Holmes paid the driver and stood for a moment, studying the building's exterior with that penetrating gaze of his, as though the bricks themselves might yield secrets. Associates, he murmured, yet I see no evidence of any associate. The singular Vale would have been more honest, though perhaps less impressive to potential clients. We entered, a small bell chiming above the door. The interior was a curious mixture of gallery and workshop. The front room, where we now stood, was arranged as a display space. Paintings hung on dark green walls, each with its own small brass plaque indicating title and price. The works were varied: portraits, still lifes, the occasional classical scene, all executed with technical skill, but lacking any spark of genuine inspiration. It was the art of capable craftsmen rather than true artists, the sort that filled the walls of middle-class homes and made no one uncomfortable. But it was the smell that commanded my immediate attention, a rich, complex aroma of oil paints and varnish, turpentine and something else. A sharp, almost metallic note that caught in the back of the throat. Holmes inhaled deeply, his nostrils flaring, his eyes brightening with interest. Linseed oil, he said quietly, as much to himself as to me. Damar varnish, turpentine, of course, mineral spirits, and beneath it all, What is that, Watson? That acrid undertone? Before I could respond, a voice called from the back of the shop. "One moment, please. I shall be with you directly." We waited, and I took the opportunity to examine the space more closely. The floors were wide pine boards, scarred and stained with decades of dropped pigment and spilled solvent. A long table near the window held various tools of the restorer's trade. Brushes of every size, arranged in ceramic jars, palette knives, scrapers, bottles of various liquids with handwritten labels, tins of powdered pigments. In one corner stood an easel with a canvas, half cleaned, the centuries of yellowed varnish removed from one side, revealing brighter colours beneath, while the other side remained dark and obscured. A curtain at the rear of the room shifted aside, and a man emerged, wiping his hands on a cloth already stained with a rainbow of colours. He was perhaps 50 years of age, of medium height, but slight build, with thinning grey hair combed carefully over a balding pate. His face was narrow and intelligent, with deep-set eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles and a small, neat beard shot through with silver. He wore a paint-stained smock over a shirt and waistcoat, and his fingers, even after wiping, bore the indelible marks of his trade. Paint ground into every crease and whorl, staining the nail-beds a permanent brownish grey. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice cultured and pleasant, though I detected a note of wariness in it. "Welcome to my humble establishment. Are you in need of restoration services, or are you perhaps interested in acquiring a piece?" His eyes moved between us, assessing, and I saw the moment he registered something in Holmes's bearing that made him uncertain. Holmes smiled, that thin, disarming smile he employed when he wished to put someone off guard. "Neither, at present, though I greatly admire your work. You are Mr. Cornelius Vale, I presume?" "I am." The wariness had intensified, though he maintained his pleasant expression. "And you are?" "My name is Sherlock Holmes. This is my colleague, Dr. John Watson. We are here regarding a restoration you recently completed, a portrait of Mrs. Constance Ashford." The colour drained from Vale's face with startling rapidity, leaving him pale as chalk. His hands, still clutching the stained cloth, began to tremble visibly. Yes, I restored that portrait. But I was told that Mrs. Ashford has passed away. A terrible tragedy. I sent my condolences to Mr. Ashford, naturally, but I fail to see how your restoration might be connected to her death," Holmes supplied, his tone mild. "Perhaps it is not. I am merely gathering information, Mr. Vale. The portrait displayed an unusual phenomenon on the evening of Mrs. Ashford's death. It appeared to weep dark tears, varnish, I believe. Can you explain how such a thing might occur?" Vale's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. He set down the cloth with exaggerated care, his movements stiff, mechanical. Varnish doesn't simply weep, Mr. Holmes. It is chemically inert once cured. Unless the curing process was incomplete, and heat caused it to liquefy again. But I use damar resin, which has been employed for centuries precisely because of its stability. I cannot imagine. He trailed off, his eyes sliding away from Holmes's penetrating gaze. Holmes moved toward the work table, his hands clasped behind his back, examining the array of materials with apparent casualness. "You work exclusively with traditional materials, then? Nothing experimental? No modern synthetic resins or compounds?" "I am a restorer, Mr. Holmes, not a chemist. I use tried and tested methods, materials that have proven themselves over centuries of use. There was a defensive edge to his voice now, a brittleness that had not been there before. "And yet," Holmes said softly, lifting a small bottle from the table and holding it up to the light, "here I find copal resin, which is notoriously difficult to work with, requiring significant heat to dissolve, and prone to darkening over time. Not a traditional choice for fine portrait restoration, I think." Vale's jaw tightened. "That is for other work, not for portraits of that quality. I would never." "And this," Holmes continued, setting down the first bottle and lifting another, this one smaller, with a handwritten label in Latin that I could not read from my position. "This appears to be something rather more exotic. Would you care to enlighten me as to its purpose?" For a long moment, Vale said nothing. The ticking of a clock somewhere in the back room seemed unnaturally loud in the silence. Finally, he drew himself up, attempting to reassert some dignity. "Mr. Holmes, I do not know what you are implying, but I assure you my work on the Ashford portrait was entirely orthodox. If some chemical reaction has occurred since its completion, that is not my responsibility. Environmental factors, improper care, exposure to excessive heat. The portrait hung in the same drawing room for 3 years without incident," Holmes interrupted, his voice still pleasant, but with an edge of steel beneath it. "Only after your restoration did it begin to weep. Weep, Mr. Vale, in a manner that suggests not accident but design, theatrical timing, psychological effect. Tell me, were you paid particularly well for this commission?" Vale's face flushed now, anger replacing pallor. "I was paid fairly for skilled work. The portrait was in need of cleaning, revarnishing, minor inpainting where the original had deteriorated. I spent 2 weeks in that house, working in less than ideal conditions, with that insufferable cousin hovering over me, questioning every decision." He stopped abruptly, as though realizing he had said too much. Holmes's eyebrows rose fractionally. "Ah, Leonard Ashford took an interest in your work?" "More than an interest. He was intrusive, constantly asking about materials, techniques, the properties of different varnishes and resins. I assumed it was mere curiosity, the enthusiasm of a dilettante. He claimed to dabble in painting himself, though I saw no evidence of any talent." "And did he suggest any particular approaches to the restoration, any specific materials or techniques?" Vale hesitated, and I could see the calculation in his eyes, how much to admit, how much to conceal. Holmes saw it too, and pressed his advantage. "Mr. Vale, Mrs. Ashford is dead. Whatever role your restoration played in that death, deliberate or accidental, it will come to light. Your cooperation now may mean the difference between being viewed as an unwitting tool or as a willing accomplice." The words struck home. Vale sank onto a stool near the work table, suddenly looking much older, more frail. "He paid me," he said quietly. "Leonard Ashford. Not Edmund. Leonard. He said it was to be a surprise for his cousin, a gift. He paid me 3 times my usual fee, in cash, half in advance. And he asked if there was any way to make the portrait more dramatic, more striking, something that would capture attention." "And you suggested?" "I suggested nothing. He was the one who mentioned heat-reactive varnishes, who brought me a sample of resin he claimed to have acquired from a continental source. He said it would create a luminous effect under firelight, make the colors glow. I was skeptical, but he was persistent. And the money..." He raised his hands helplessly. I am not a wealthy man, Mr. Holmes. Restoration pays poorly unless one has wealthy patrons, and I have struggled these past years. The offer was too generous to refuse. Holmes had moved closer now, standing directly before Vale, his gaze boring into the smaller man. This resin Leonard provided? Did you test it? Yes. I mixed a small amount with my usual damar varnish and applied it to a scrap of canvas. When I held it near a flame, it did indeed create a beautiful effect. The colours deepened, seemed to glow from within. But after several minutes of exposure to heat, something strange happened. The varnish began to soften, to run slightly, forming small droplets. I asked Leonard about it, and he laughed. He said it was a feature, not a flaw, that it would fade again as the canvas cooled, creating a temporary effect that would intrigue viewers. And you believed this? Vale's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. I wanted to believe it. I needed the money. And I told myself it was harmless. A parlor trick, nothing more. A conversation piece for wealthy clients. I did not. He stopped, his voice breaking. I did not know anyone would die. You must believe me, Mr. Holmes. I am guilty of greed, of poor judgment perhaps, but not of murder. Holmes regarded him in silence for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he turned to the work table, selected a small wooden spatula, and carefully scraped a tiny amount of residue from the rim of one of the varnish bottles into a paper packet he produced from his coat. I will need to analyze this, he said, more to himself than to us. But I suspect I already know what I will find. He faced Vale again. This resin Leonard provided. Do you have any of it remaining? Vale nodded mutely and rose, moving on unsteady legs to a cabinet at the back of the room. He returned with a small glass vial, perhaps an ounce in volume, half filled with a thick amber liquid that seemed to move sluggishly when he tilted it. Holmes took it carefully, holding it up to the window light, his eyes narrowing. And Leonard Ashford has been here since the restoration was completed? Since Mrs. Ashford's death? He came 2 days ago. He seemed agitated. He asked if I had disposed of all materials related to the commission, if I had kept any records. I told him I had burned my preliminary sketches and notes, as he had requested. He seemed relieved. But you kept this vial? A ghost of defiance crossed Vale's features. I keep samples of all materials I use, Mr. Holmes. It is professional practice, in case a client later requests matching work, and— He hesitated, and something about the entire affair troubled me. I could not say what, precisely, but I felt I should retain evidence, should questions arise. Holmes pocketed the vial with a slight nod of what might have been approval. You may yet find yourself grateful for that instinct, Mr. Vale. Now, one final question. Did Leonard Ashford ever discuss his cousin's wife? In your hearing? Did he express any particular opinion of her? Any resentment or ill feeling? Vale's brow furrowed in thought. He mentioned her only in passing, and always with apparent affection. He said she was a good woman, that Edmund was fortunate, but there was— He paused, searching for words. There was something in his tone when he spoke of their marriage. Not quite bitter, but wistful, perhaps, as though he envied his cousin's happiness, or resented it. I see. Holmes moved toward the door, then paused, turning back. Mr. Vale, you will make yourself available should the police wish to speak with you. You will not leave London, you will not communicate with Leonard Ashford, and you will not dispose of any materials, any samples, any records related to this matter. Do I make myself clear?" Vale nodded, the movement jerky, mechanical. "Crystal clear, Mr. Holmes. But tell me, was it truly murder? Did my work, my greed, my willingness to look away, did it kill that poor woman?" Holmes's expression softened fractionally. "Your work was a tool, Mr. Vale, nothing more. The hand that wielded that tool, the mind that conceived the crime, those are the truly guilty parties. You were deceived and exploited, which is not the same as being blameless. But neither are you a murderer. Hold to that distinction in the days ahead. You may need it." We left him standing there in his cluttered studio, surrounded by the instruments of his craft, looking small and defeated among the shadows and the smell of old varnish. Outside, the afternoon had grown darker, the clouds thickening, and the first drops of rain began to spatter against the cobblestones. Holmes walked briskly, his coat collar turned up against the weather, the glass vial safely tucked in his pocket. I hurried to keep pace, my mind churning with what we had learned. "Holmes," I said, "surely we have enough now to confront Leonard Ashford? To accuse him?" He shook his head. "We have suspicion, Watson, and circumstantial evidence. We have a vial of unusual varnish and a restorer's confession of accepting payment for questionable work. But we do not yet have the mechanism of death. We know the portrait was designed to weep, to create psychological terror. But how did that kill Constance Ashford? What was the actual cause of death? Until we can answer that, we cannot prove murder. We can only suggest it. The doctor certified it as heart failure, did he not? Which proves nothing. Poison can stop the heart, Watson. So can fear, or suffocation, or a dozen other causes that leave no obvious mark. No, we must return to the house tonight, when the fire is lit again, when we can recreate the conditions of that fatal evening. Only then will we see the complete picture. The rain fell harder now, cold and steady, and we hailed another hansom to carry us back toward Baker Street. As we rattled through the darkening streets, I found myself thinking of that portrait, of those painted eyes weeping their dark tears, and of the woman who had sat before it in her last moments, unaware that beauty and artistry had been twisted into instruments of death. "It is a wicked business," I said quietly. Holmes turned to me, rain streaming down the window beside him, London's lights blurring into amber smears against the glass. "The wickedest sort, Watson. Murder dressed in aesthetic beauty, cruelty disguised as craft. But we will unmask it. Before this day ends, the weeping portrait will give up its final secret, and justice—" He paused, his jaw tightening. "Justice will have its accounting." The rain had settled into a steady, persistent rhythm by the time we returned to Baker Street, the kind of November downpour that seemed less like weather and more like a permanent condition of London itself. Mrs. Hudson met us at the door with towels and warm tea, clucking softly at our damp state, and we retreated to our sitting room, where the fire had been built up against the encroaching cold. Holmes went immediately to his chemical apparatus, that curious collection of beakers and burners and glass tubing that occupied one corner of our quarters, and set about analyzing the vial Vale had given him. I watched him work in silence, sipping my tea, feeling the warmth gradually return to my fingers and toes. The room filled with the acrid smell of heating chemicals, and Holmes moved with the focused precision of a surgeon, adding drops of this reagent and that, holding test tubes up to the lamplight, making notations in his methodical hand. Outside, the rain continued its soft percussion against the windows, and somewhere in the distance a church bell tolled 4 o'clock, the sound muffled and dreamlike through the weather. At last Holmes straightened, setting down his pipette with a soft clink. His face was grave, his eyes distant with calculation. "As I suspected," he said quietly, "the varnish itself is a mixture of damar resin and copal, with an additions of a heat-reactive compound, likely a form of beeswax mixed with something else, something that liquefies at relatively low temperatures. Clever, actually. Under normal conditions, the varnish would remain solid, but expose it to sustained warmth, such as from a nearby fireplace, and it begins to soften, to run, the theatrical effect Leonard desired. But that alone could not have killed her, I said. No, that alone merely created terror, psychological distress. But Watson, there is something else in this mixture, something I did not expect to find in an artist's varnish." He lifted a small glass slide to the light, where a crystalline residue glinted faintly. "Arsenious oxide, white arsenic, in minute quantities, suspended in the varnish matrix." The words struck me like a physical blow. "Arsenic? Good God, Holmes, you're saying the varnish itself was poisoned?" "Not merely the varnish. Come, let me show you." He moved to the table where he had sketched the Ashford drawing-room the previous night, and now he added new details with quick, sure strokes. Picture the scene. The portrait hangs above the fireplace, close enough to receive significant heat when the fire is built up for the evening. The varnish, containing both the heat-reactive wax and microscopic arsenic crystals, begins to warm. The wax softens and runs, creating the tears, the theatrical component. But simultaneously, the heat causes something else to occur. He tapped his pencil against the drawing of the fireplace. "Arsenic, when heated, can sublime, transform from solid directly to vapor. Not all of it, and not quickly, but over the course of an evening, with sustained heat, enough arsenic vapor would be released to sicken someone sitting in close proximity. And Mrs. Ashford sat always in the same chair, directly beneath the portrait, directly in the path of rising heat and whatever it carried with it." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the rain outside. But surely everyone in the room would have been affected? To some degree, perhaps. But think, Watson, the arsenic vapor would rise with the heat, would be most concentrated in the immediate vicinity of the fireplace and the portrait. Mrs. Ashford sat closest, in her habitual place. The guests would have been seated farther away, in chairs arranged for conversation. The exposure would not have been uniform. A slow poisoning, then, over multiple evenings. Holmes nodded grimly. The portrait was restored and rehung a month before her death, Ashford said. A month of fires lit in that drawing-room. A month of evenings spent in her favourite chair, breathing in trace amounts of poison. Not enough to kill in a single exposure, but cumulative. Her system weakened gradually, her heart compromised. And then, on that final evening, the combination of the theatrical shock, the portrait appearing to weep, the terror of it, and the additional poison inhalation proved too much. Her heart, already damaged, simply failed. The elegance of it was horrifying. I set down my teacup, my hands suddenly unsteady. "It's diabolical, Holmes, a locked room of the most insidious kind. The weapon was invisible, the delivery mechanism disguised as art, and the victim placed herself in position every evening by her own comfortable habit. Precisely. And the genius of it is this. Even if a doctor had suspected poison, the amounts in her system would have been minimal. Chronic arsenic exposure can mimic natural illness, weakness, digestive troubles, heart palpitations. The symptoms would have been gradual enough to attribute to any number of causes, and after death, with the body cremated or buried, any evidence would be lost forever. But Leonard couldn't have known she would die that specific night, surely? No, but he didn't need to. The psychological component, the weeping portrait, was insurance. If the poison worked slowly, well and good. If it worked too slowly, the theatrical horror would accelerate matters, either through fear-induced heart failure or by driving the household to destroy the portrait, at which point he could claim his cousin's wife had died of some curse or nervous affliction. Either way, he wins. Either way, she dies, and he inherits. I rose and moved to the window, staring out at the rain-washed street below. A lamplighter was making his rounds, touching flame to each gas lamp in turn, small islands of light blooming in the gathering dusk. "We must return to the house tonight," I said. "We must prove this before Ashford or anyone else is exposed further." Already arranged. Holmes consulted his pocket watch. "I sent a note to Edmund Ashford while you were changing out of your wet clothes. I asked him to have the drawing-room prepared exactly as it was on the evening of his wife's death. Same fire, same arrangement of furniture, same everything. And I asked that Leonard be present, along with any servants who were in the house that night. We will recreate the scene, Watson, and we will demonstrate precisely how Constance Ashford was murdered. And if Leonard refuses to attend, if he suspects we're on to him—" Holmes smiled, that cold, predatory expression I had learned to recognize. "He will attend because his vanity will not allow him to do otherwise. He believes himself clever, Watson. He believes his crime was perfect. He will come to see us fail, to watch us fumble for explanations, and in that confidence he will damn himself." The hours until our evening appointment passed slowly. Holmes busied himself with preparations, gathering small bottles and instruments from his chemical supplies, consulting various texts on toxicology and metallurgy, making careful notes in his record book. I tried to read, but found my mind wandering back to the Ashford house, to that sombre drawing-room with its burden of secrets, to the portrait that had wept varnish and death. As darkness fell in earnest, we prepared to leave. Holmes packed a small leather case with his implements, including the vial from Vale's studio, and several testing apparatus. We dressed warmly, for the rain had not ceased, and the temperature had dropped further, bringing with it the raw, penetrating cold that November in London does so well. The carriage Ashford had sent arrived precisely at 7 o'clock. The driver was the same weathered man who had collected us that morning, though he looked even more grim now, his face set in lines of worry and fatigue. The journey through rain-dark streets felt longer than it had by daylight, the familiar landmarks transformed by weather and night into something foreign and slightly menacing. Gas lamps flickered in the wind, their light reflecting off wet cobblestones in streaks of amber and shadow. Few people were abroad in such weather, and those we passed hurried along with heads down, umbrellas tilted against the driving rain. Belgravia, when we reached it, seemed even more withdrawn than it had that morning, its grand houses shuttered and remote, fortresses against the storm. The Ashford residence loomed before us, lights burning in several windows, smoke rising from multiple chimneys to be torn away immediately by the wind. We descended from the carriage and mounted the steps quickly, and the door opened before Holmes could knock, revealing the elderly butler, Wilkins. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he said, his voice even more subdued than it had been that morning. "Mr. Ashford awaits you in the drawing-room. Everyone is assembled as you requested, though." He hesitated, his professional mask slipping fractionally. "Though I confess, sir, there is a darkness to this business that troubles me greatly. I have served this family for 20 years, and I would not have thought—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "All will be revealed shortly," Holmes said gently, "and you may find that those you trusted were not who you believed them to be." Wilkins took our wet coats, led us through the entrance hall to the drawing-room. The door stood open, and warm light spilled out into the corridor, along with the crackle of a substantial fire and the murmur of voices. We entered, and the scene before us was almost exactly as I had imagined it during Holmes's earlier description. The fire burned high in the grate, casting dancing shadows across the room. The furniture had been arranged as it must have been on that fatal evening. Several chairs in a conversational grouping, and one chair, that burgundy velvet chair, positioned close to the hearth, directly beneath the portrait. Edmund Ashford sat in a chair near the piano, his face haggard, his hands gripping the armrests as though to anchor himself. Beside him stood the footman, Perkins, looking young and frightened, and near the window, affecting an air of casual unconcern, but with tension visible in every line of his body, stood Leonard Ashford. He turned as we entered, and I saw the quick calculation, in his pale eyes, the assessment and dismissal. "Ah, Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, Edmund tells me you wish to recreate the evening of my poor cousin's death. A strange request, but then you are known for strange methods, are you not? I confess I am curious to see what you hope to discover that the doctor who attended her did not." Holmes did not rise to the bait. He moved instead to the centre of the room, setting down his leather case, and stood for a moment in silence, his gaze travelling from the fire to the portrait, to the chair, and back again. The portrait loomed above us, Constance Ashford's painted face serene and lovely in the firelight, though the dark trails from her eyes gave her expression a terrible sadness. "Gentlemen," Holmes said at last, his voice quiet, but carrying easily in the still room, "we are gathered here because a murder was committed in this house, a murder of extraordinary cunning, executed over the course of weeks, invisible to all observers until it was too late. Mrs. Constance Ashford did not die of natural heart failure. She was poisoned, slowly and deliberately, by someone who understood both chemistry and human nature, who could manipulate both materials and emotions to achieve his goal." Edmund Ashford made a sound like a wounded animal, his face crumbling. Leonard, by contrast, went very still, his expression carefully neutral, though his hands had clenched into fists at his sides. "That is a serious accusation, Mr. Holmes," Leonard said, his voice steady, despite the slight tremor beneath it. "Have you any proof of this remarkable claim?" "I have proof, Mr. Ashford, more than sufficient proof. But first, let me demonstrate the mechanism of death." Holmes opened his case and withdrew several items. A small metal stand, a candle, and a glass tube, sealed at one end. "Dr. Watson, if you would be so kind as to extinguish the gas lamps. I wish the fire to be our primary source of heat and light, exactly as it was on that evening. I moved around the room, turning down each lamp until only the firelight remained, painting everything in shades of gold and shadow. The effect was immediately more intimate, more ominous. The portrait seemed almost alive in the dancing light, and I could well imagine the horror of seeing those painted eyes begin to weep. Holmes had positioned his apparatus on a table near the fireplace, and was carefully scraping a tiny amount of substance from the vial Vale had given him into the glass tube. "What I hold here," he said, "is a sample of the varnish used to restore Mrs. Ashford's portrait, or a special varnish commissioned by someone in this room, mixed to specifications that were anything but innocent." He placed the tube in the metal stand and held it near the fire's heat. For a moment, nothing happened, and then, slowly, the substance within the tube began to change. It softened, darkened, and a faint trail of vapor began to rise from it, visible as a thin wisp in the firelight. "Observe," Holmes said quietly. "The varnish liquefies under heat, creating the theatrical effect of tears. But it also releases something else, something invisible under normal circumstances, but deadly over time." He produced a second piece of apparatus, a small glass plate coated with some reagent, and held it in the path of the rising vapor. Within seconds, the coating began to change color, turning from pale yellow to a distinct orange-brown. "Arsenic," Holmes announced, his voice hard now, cutting. "White arsenic, suspended in the varnish, subliming into vapor when heated. Mrs. Ashford sat in that chair." He pointed to the empty seat beneath the portrait, evening after evening for a month, breathing in trace amounts of poison. Not enough to kill quickly, but enough to weaken her heart, to sicken her gradually. And on the final evening, when the portrait performed its theatrical trick and she saw those painted tears, the shock combined with the accumulated poison was enough to stop her heart entirely. The silence in the room was absolute. Even the fire seemed to quiet, as though the house itself were holding its breath. Edmund Ashford stared at Holmes with an expression of dawning horror and grief. Perkins had gone pale as chalk, and Leonard's mask had slipped. His face was no longer carefully neutral, but twisted with something ugly, rage and fear, and a desperate calculation all mixed together. "You cannot prove this," he said, his voice low and venomous. "You have a theory. Nothing more. Varnish and vapor and coincidence. I have testimony from Cornelius Vale that you provided the varnish recipe and paid him handsomely to use it. I have chemical analysis proving the presence of arsenic. I have motive. You stand to inherit your cousin's entire estate, do you not, in the absence of direct heirs? And I have method and opportunity. You arranged the restoration, you were present during its execution, and you ensured the portrait would be positioned exactly where its deadly effect would be most concentrated." Holmes's voice rose now, filled with righteous fury. "You murdered Constance Ashford, Leonard Ashford, as surely as if you had held a pistol to her head. More surely, for you condemned her to weeks of slow suffering before the final blow." Leonard's hand moved toward his coat pocket, and I saw the glint of metal. But I was already moving, my old military instincts taking over, and I had my service revolver out and levelled at him before he could draw whatever weapon he had concealed. "I wouldn't," I said quietly. For a moment he seemed poised to try anyway. Then something in him broke, and he sagged, his hand falling away from his pocket. "She had everything," he whispered, his voice raw with decades of accumulated bitterness. Everything that should have been mine, Edmund's love, his fortune, his name. I was family, but I might as well have been a servant for all the regard I received. And she, his voice cracked, she was kind to me, gentle, and I hated her for it, because her kindness was pity, and I did not want pity. I wanted what was mine by right. Edmund Ashford rose slowly from his chair, and the look on his face was terrible to behold, grief and rage and betrayal all warring for dominance. He took a step toward his cousin, then stopped, as though unable to bear coming any closer to such monstrous selfishness. Holmes nodded to me, and I moved to take Leonard's arm, securing his hands behind him with my handkerchief, while Holmes sent Perkins to fetch the police. The footman fled with obvious relief, and we were left in that firelit room with the weight of confession hanging in the air, and the portrait looking down on us all, its painted tears a mockery of real sorrow. "It's done," Holmes said quietly to Edmund Ashford. "The portrait will be removed and destroyed. The poison will harm no one else. And justice, though it cannot return what you have lost, will at least ensure that greed does not triumph over innocence." The older man nodded slowly, unable to speak, and sank back into his chair, his face buried in his hands. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing the streets of London clean, though some stains, I knew, would take far longer to fade. The police arrived within the quarter hour, summoned by Perkins, who had run through the rain-slicked streets to the nearest station with a desperation born of horror and relief mingled together. Inspector Lestrade led the contingent, a familiar face, and one that brought a measure of official weight to proceedings that had, until now, felt dreamlike and unreal in their awfulness. He entered the drawing-room with 2 constables at his heels, water dripping from his coat, his sharp eyes taking in the scene with practised efficiency. The fire still burning, the apparatus Holmes had used for his demonstration, Leonard Ashford held firmly in my grip, and Edmund Ashford collapsed in his chair, a man unmade by betrayal. "Mr. Holmes," Lestrade said, his voice carrying that mixture of respect and wariness he always employed when dealing with my friend. "The footman says there's been a murder confession. Leonard Ashford, is it?" Holmes inclined his head and proceeded to outline the case with admirable brevity, touching on the essential points. Vale's testimony, the analysis of the poisoned varnish, the mechanism of arsenic sublimation, and Leonard's own admission of motive mere moments before. As he spoke, I watched Leonard's face and saw the last vestiges of defiance drain away, leaving behind only exhaustion and something that might have been relief. Perhaps confession, even of terrible sin, carried its own peculiar comfort, the laying down of a burden too heavy to bear alone. When Holmes finished, Lestrade turned his attention to Leonard, his expression grave. "Leonard Ashford, I am placing you under arrest for the murder of Constance Ashford. You'll come with us to the station and make a formal statement." He nodded to his constables, who moved forward to take custody of the prisoner. Leonard went with them without resistance, his movements mechanical, his gaze fixed on nothing in particular. As they led him toward the door, he paused, turning back to look at his cousin. "Edmund," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I would ask for your forgiveness, but I know I have no right to it. I can only say, I did not wish her to suffer. I only wished—" He trailed off, unable or unwilling to complete the thought, and then he was gone, taken away into the November night and the rain that had not ceased its steady fall. Edmund remained motionless for a long moment after the door closed. Then, with visible effort, he raised his head and looked at Holmes. "Thank you," he said hoarsely. "I would have thought her death natural, would have lived the rest of my life believing it was simply cruel fate. To know the truth is, it is terrible, Mr. Holmes. But it is also necessary. I am grateful, though gratitude feels inadequate to the circumstance." Holmes moved to stand before him, and his expression held an uncommon gentleness. "The truth is rarely kind, Mr. Ashford, but it is the only foundation upon which one can rebuild. Your cousin's crime was born of envy and weakness, but it was also enabled by opportunity and your own generosity. That is not your fault, but it is a lesson worth remembering. Kindness to those who harbour resentment can sometimes blind us to danger." "What should I do now?" Edmund asked, the question of a man lost in unfamiliar territory, seeking any guidance that might illuminate the path forward. "First, have the portrait removed and destroyed, not burned. The arsenic in the varnish would release toxic fumes. It should be taken to the authorities, sealed, and disposed of properly. Second, have this room thoroughly cleaned, the chimney swept, every surface washed. The amounts of poison were small, but caution is warranted. Third," Holmes paused, considering. "Third, allow yourself to grieve properly, not just for your wife, but for the cousin you thought you knew. Betrayal leaves its own wounds, Mr. Ashford, and they require tending just as much as any other." Edmund nodded slowly, absorbing the words. "And the house? Can I continue to live here, knowing what happened within these walls?" "That," Holmes said quietly, "is a question only you can answer. Some men find peace in staying, in reclaiming a space from tragedy. Others find it necessary to leave, to begin again elsewhere. There is no shame in either choice. But do not make the decision tonight, in the immediate wake of revelation. Give yourself time. The house will wait." Lestrade, who had been conferring quietly with his remaining constable, approached us. "We'll need formal statements from both of you gentlemen if you can come to the station tomorrow morning. And Mr. Ashford, I'm afraid we'll need access to the house for the next few days. Evidence collection, documentation, that sort of thing. Can you make alternative arrangements for lodging?" Edmund stirred as if waking from a trance. Yes, of course. I have a club. I can stay there. Wilkins will assist with whatever you require." He rose, moving stiffly, and pulled the bell cord. The elderly butler appeared almost instantly, and I wondered if he had been waiting just outside, anticipating the need for his steadying presence. "Wilkins," Edmund said, his voice stronger now, finding some reserve of composure. "The police will need access to the house. Please cooperate fully with their requests, and I will be staying at the Reform Club for the foreseeable future. Pack what I need and send it there tomorrow." "Very good, sir." If Wilkins felt any shock or distress at the evening's revelations, his face betrayed nothing. But I saw the way his hand briefly touched his employer's shoulder as he passed, a gesture of support beyond the bounds of strict professional deportment, and all the more meaningful for its rarity. We took our leave shortly thereafter, Holmes retrieving his apparatus and samples, which Lestrade agreed should remain in his custody, given their evidentiary value. The rain had lessened to a fine mist as we emerged onto the street, and the air tasted clean and cold, a welcome contrast to the close atmosphere of that drawing-room with its burden of confession and sorrow. A hansom materialized from the gloom, and we climbed in gratefully, our clothes damp, our spirits heavy despite the resolution of the case. As the cab clattered through the wet streets toward Baker Street, I found myself thinking not of Leonard's malice, but of Constance Ashford, whom I had never met but felt I knew through the portrait's rendering, a gentle woman who had died, never knowing she was murdered, never suspecting that kindness to a resentful cousin had sealed her fate. "You are troubled, Watson." Holmes observed, his voice soft in the darkness of the cab's interior. "I am thinking," I said slowly, "that this was perhaps the cruelest murder I have witnessed, not in its method, though that was cruel enough, but in its foundation. Leonard lived in that house, ate at that table, accepted Edmund's charity and Constance's kindness, all while plotting her death. How does a man bear such duplicity?" Holmes was silent for a moment, his profile sharp against the passing lights of the city. "I have observed," he said at last, "that envy is perhaps the most corrosive of human emotions. It doesn't burn hot like anger or rage, which expend themselves quickly. Rather, it smoulders, feeding on every perceived slight, every reminder of what one lacks, until it consumes everything else within a man. Leonard did not wake one morning and decide to murder. He arrived at that point through years, perhaps decades, of nursing his grievances, of comparing his lot to his cousin's, and finding it wanting. By the time he acted, I suspect he had convinced himself it was justified, that he was merely reclaiming what should have been his all along. That does not excuse it. No, it explains it, which is not the same as excusing it. Understanding the pathology of a crime does not absolve the criminal, Watson. It merely illuminates the path that led him there, so that others might recognize the warning signs and turn aside before reaching the same destination. We lapsed into silence again, each absorbed in our own thoughts. The streets grew more familiar as we approached Baker Street, the landmarks I had come to know so well over our years together, the shop fronts and corners and lamp-posts that marked the geography of home. When we finally arrived at 221B, Mrs. Hudson was waiting with hot soup and bread, her kind face creased with concern when she saw our exhausted state. "You've had a terrible evening. I can see it, plain as day," she said, ushering us toward the sitting room where the fire had been maintained in our absence. "Sit, both of you, and warm yourselves. I'll not have you catching your death after saving someone else's life, or however these cases of yours work out." We obeyed without protest, sinking gratefully into our familiar chairs, accepting the soup she pressed upon us with maternal insistence. The warmth of the room, the simple comfort of food and fire and safety, gradually loosened the tension that had gripped us since entering the Ashford house. Holmes ate in silence, his gaze distant, and I knew he was still turning the case over in his mind, examining it from every angle, ensuring he had missed nothing. But I knew him well enough to recognize that this case had affected him more than most. Perhaps because the crime was so intimate, so rooted in the corruption of domestic trust. Perhaps because Constance Ashford had died without even the cold comfort of knowing her death had meaning or purpose. She was simply an obstacle to be removed, a life extinguished for the sake of money and wounded pride. At last, Holmes set aside his empty bowl and reached for his pipe, that invariable companion of his reflective moods. "Tomorrow," he said. "We will give our statements to Lestrade, and Leonard Ashford will be formally charged. There will be a trial, likely a brief one given his confession. He will hang, I expect, though a clever barrister might argue for transportation instead, claiming diminished responsibility or temporary madness. Either way, his life as he knew it is ended. And Edmund? Edmund will survive. He is wounded, certainly, but not broken. He has resources, financial and, I suspect, emotional reserves he's not yet tapped. In time, he may even find some measure of peace. He is still young enough to rebuild." I nodded, too weary to reply. Outside, the rain had stopped at last, and through the window I could see stars emerging from between the breaking clouds, cold and distant and eternal. The city below was settling into its late-night rhythms, the streets quieting, the last of the evening's traffic making its way home. Holmes lit his pipe, and the familiar sweet smoke curled upward in the lamplight. "You will write this one up, I trust?" he asked, a hint of his usual humour returning to his voice. "Perhaps," I said, "though I wonder if it might not be better to let it remain unpublished, out of respect for Edmund's privacy." Holmes considered this, then nodded slowly. "A fair point. Some cases perhaps deserve the obscurity of private resolution rather than the glare of public record. This may be one of them." And so we sat in companionable silence, two men who had witnessed the worst of human nature, and yet somehow retained faith that justice, though imperfect, still had meaning. Outside, London slept and dreamed its 1,000 dreams, and somewhere in the vast city, a man sat in a cell contemplating the ruin he had made of his life, while another sat in a club-room and grieved. For a wife he had loved and a cousin he had trusted, both now lost to him forever. 3 weeks passed before I saw Edmund Ashford again, and the transformation in the man was remarkable. It was a grey December morning when he called upon us at Baker Street, the kind of day when frost lingered in shadowed corners and one's breath misted in the air, even indoors, until the fires had been well established. Mrs. Hudson showed him up, and I rose to greet him, noting immediately the change in his bearing. He stood straighter now, his shoulders no longer bowed beneath the weight of grief and shock. His face, while still marked by sorrow, had lost that terrible hollowness I had seen on the night of Leonard's arrest. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he said, accepting the chair Holmes offered near the fire. "I hope I am not intruding. I wish to call upon you both, to thank you properly, and to tell you—" He paused, searching for words. "To tell you that I am still here, still standing. I was not certain I would be in those first days." Holmes nodded, setting aside the monograph on medieval pottery he had been annotating. "I am gratified to see it, Mr. Ashford. You have weathered a terrible storm. How do you find yourself now?" Ashford accepted the tea I poured for him, wrapping his hands around the cup as though drawing warmth from it. "Better than I expected. The trial concluded last week, as you may have heard. Leonard was convicted, sentenced to hang. I did not attend. I could not bear to see him in the dock, to hear the details recounted in open court. But my solicitor kept me informed." He took a sip of tea, his gaze distant. "I find I have no satisfaction in his punishment, Mr. Holmes. No sense of justice served, only a profound sadness that it came to this at all." "That speaks well of your character," I said quietly. "Vengeance brings little peace, I have found. Only the passage of time and the choice to move forward can do that." "Yes, time," Ashford smiled, faintly. "I have returned to the house, you know. I was not certain I could, but in the end it is my home, Constance's home. I could not let Leonard's crime drive me from it, could not allow him that final victory. So I went back." Holmes leaned forward slightly, his interest piqued. "And how did you find it?" "Changed. The drawing room has been entirely redone. New wallpaper, new furniture, the fireplace surround replaced. The portrait, of course, is gone, destroyed, as you instructed. Where it hung, I have placed a landscape, something peaceful. Hills and sky and clouds, nothing that carries memory or weight." He set down his cup, his expression thoughtful. "The house feels different now, lighter, somehow, as though a shadow has been lifted from it. The servants have returned. They had been frightened, you understand, by rumours and superstition. But once I explained that there was no curse, no supernatural evil, only human wickedness that has now been excised, they came back. Wilkins never left, of course. He is a constant in a world that has proven less constant than I believed." We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the fire crackling gently, London's distant sounds drifting up from the street below. Then Ashford reached into his coat and withdrew an envelope, which he placed on the table between us. "I know you do not typically accept payment beyond your standard fees, Mr. Holmes, but I wish to offer something more. Not as payment, precisely, but as acknowledgment. You gave me truth when I might have lived the rest of my life in ignorance. That is worth more than any sum." Holmes regarded the envelope without touching it. "The truth was its own reward, Mr. Ashford, and the prevention of further harm, for surely Leonard's greed would not have stopped with your wife's death. He would have continued, perhaps turned his attention to you eventually, once sufficient time had passed. No, I require no additional compensation. Keep your money. Use it to rebuild your life, perhaps to honour your wife's memory in some meaningful way." Ashford's eyes brightened with sudden emotion, and he nodded, returning the envelope to his pocket. "Then I shall do so. There is a charitable foundation Constance supported. Work with orphaned children. I will endow it in her name, ensure that her kindness continues, even in her absence." "A fitting memorial," I said, moved by the gesture. "She would have approved, I think." "I believe she would." Ashford rose, and we stood with him. "I will not take more of your time, gentlemen. I only wished you to know that your work had meaning beyond the solving of a puzzle. You restored not just justice, but the possibility of peace. For that I am eternally grateful." Holmes shook his hand firmly. "Live well, Mr. Ashford. That is gratitude enough." We saw him to the door, and watched from the window as he descended to the street, and walked away into the grey morning, his step purposeful, his head high, a man who had looked into darkness and chosen, despite everything, to seek the light. "He will be all right," Holmes said quietly, more to himself than to me. "Yes," I agreed. "I believe he will." Holmes returned to his chair and his monograph, but I noticed he did not immediately resume his reading. Instead, he sat gazing into the fire, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin in that attitude of deep thought I knew so well. "You are thinking of the case," I ventured. "I am thinking," he said slowly, "of how much evil can be accomplished by a small man with a grievance and just enough cleverness to be dangerous. Leonard Ashford wasn't a criminal mastermind, Watson. He was a mediocre man who resented his mediocrity and blamed others for it. Yet he very nearly committed the perfect murder. Had he been content to let the poison work slowly, to allow natural causes to be presumed, we might never have been called. It was his vanity that undid him, the theatrical weeping. Portrait, the need to create drama alongside death. Pride, as always, preceding the fall. And yet, I said, it was also pride that allowed you to trap him. His certainty that he was cleverer than anyone else, that he could watch you investigate and emerge unscathed. He could not resist being present for his own unmasking. Holmes smiled faintly. True, human nature provides both the motive for crime and the means of its detection. We are, in the end, predictable creatures for all our pretensions to complexity. I settled back into my chair, picking up the journal I had abandoned earlier. Outside, the day progressed toward afternoon, the winter sun never quite managing to break through the clouds. London carried on with its usual magnificent indifference. Millions of lives intersecting and diverging. Tragedies and triumphs playing out in drawing rooms and back alleys, in grand houses and humble lodgings. And in our sitting room at 221B Baker Street, two men sat in companionable silence, having added one more case to the annals of solved mysteries, one more wrong set right, one more small victory against the darkness that sometimes dwelt in human hearts. The portrait that wept varnish was gone, destroyed along with its poison. But the memory of Constance Ashford would live on in the charitable works that bore her name, in the rebuilt house that had once been her home, and in the heart of the man who had loved her, and would continue to honour that love through the life he chose to live. It was, I reflected, as much justice as this imperfect world allows. And sometimes that has to be enough. Spring came to London, as it always does, tentatively at first, as though uncertain of its welcome, then with increasing confidence, until even the most hardened sceptic could no longer deny that winter had released its grip. The trees along Baker Street put forth tender green leaves, and the air lost its bitter edge, growing soft and mild. On my walks through the city, noticed the flower sellers' baskets overflowing with daffodils and early roses, and the people themselves seemed lighter somehow, unburdened by heavy coats and the perpetual grey that had defined the darker months. It was on one such spring morning, nearly 6 months after the resolution of the Ashford case, that a letter arrived bearing Edmund Ashford's familiar hand. I opened it over breakfast, while Holmes worked through the Times, and read with growing pleasure the news it contained. "Holmes," I said, setting down the letter, "Edmund Ashford has remarried." Holmes glanced up, his eyebrows rising slightly. "Indeed? Rather quick work, some might say." "He addresses that very point. Listen, I know some will judge the brevity of my mourning, but I have learned that life is too precious and too uncertain to waste in empty observance of convention. Margaret is a widow herself, someone who understands loss and the courage required to embrace happiness again. We met through the charitable foundation I established in Constance's name. I choose to believe, that Constance would approve." I smiled, folding the letter. "He sounds genuinely content, Holmes. At peace." "Good." Holmes returned his attention to the newspaper, but I caught the slight softening around his eyes that indicated genuine satisfaction. He has chosen life over grief, action over paralysis. That is wisdom. I thought of that terrible November night, of the drawing-room with its poisoned portrait and its burden of secrets, of Leonard Ashford's bitter confession and Edmund's devastation. And now, months later, new beginnings. a house reclaimed, a heart mended, a future chosen rather than endured. "Why did you never publish this case, Watson?" Holmes asked suddenly, not looking up from his paper. "You took notes. I saw you. Yet it never appeared in any of your chronicles." I considered my answer carefully. "Because Edmund asked me not to. Not directly, perhaps, but the implication was clear. He wished to move forward, to allow the horror of it to fade into private memory rather than public record. And I found I agreed with him. Some stories deserve to be kept close, Holmes. Some truths need not be broadcast. And yet you kept your notes." "I did. And now, with his permission granted in this very letter—" I tapped the page. "I believe enough time has passed. The wound has healed sufficiently that the scar can be acknowledged without pain. Or so I hope." Holmes folded his newspaper with a decisive snap. "Then write it, Watson. Write it as you always do, with compassion for the victims, respect for the truth, and just enough dramatic flourish to keep your readers from falling asleep halfway through." I laughed at that, the sound carrying through our sitting room and out into the spring morning beyond. Below us, Baker Street bustled with life and commerce, each person carrying their own stories of triumph and tragedy, love and loss, the great tapestry of human experience continuing its endless weaving. And I picked up my pen, dipped it in ink, and began to write.